recognize myself for questions, and Mr. Cass, let me direct my first one to you. You put up a couple of slides today. One had to do with the number of heat deaths increasing exponentially, particularly in the Northeast. Would you go into just some quick detail as to why that study was flawed? And you mentioned the rhodium study as well, but take your pick. Just why are some of these studies flawed, and why should we sort of discount them?
Sure, thank you. I think to understand conceptually why they're flawed, it's important to recognize that all regions, even within the United States, adapt to their local climate. And so when you look across the country, you find, for instance, that people in the hotter parts of the country are not suffering from higher heat-related mortality than people in the cooler parts. The logical conclusion to draw from that would be that as the country gets warmer, we should not expect to see a lot more heat-related deaths because, again, people will adapt to whatever heat they face, and indeed that's what the most recent published literature shows. What studies do instead to generate large heat death estimates is to look at the reaction we have seen historically, even per hot day, or per days that are especially hot for a location, and simply extrapolate forward. If we see many more hot days, then surely we will see that many more deaths. And the EPA study is the best example of this, where they take a city like Pittsburgh and they say if 1% of Pittsburgh days have lows above 71 degrees, we will call that extreme heat for Pittsburgh. And whatever the death rate they experience on those days, they will continue to experience that death rate on days when the temperature is above a low of 71, even if that becomes very common in the future. And so you see the death rate in Pittsburgh skyrocket if you assume that. Of course, if the climate in Pittsburgh shifts to be more like that of a more southerly city, Pittsburgh's use of air conditioning and other adaptive technologies will shift as well, and the result will likely be that we will see the same low death rate that we do today.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cass. Mr. Nordhaus, I appreciated your good point that given the uncertainties, we all could use some moderation and humility. A good reminder. What I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned that we couldn't just rely upon renewable energy. We need to make better use of fossil fuels. Would you go into some detail or give examples of what you're talking about?
Well, I think the primary point that I would want to stress to this committee, a couple of things. The first is that whatever we may think we should do, the evidence is pretty strong. 70% of U.S. energy, well over 70% of U.S. primary energy still comes from fossil fuels. That's true globally. And despite long-standing efforts, that has not changed very much, going all the way back to the oil shocks of the 1970s. Part of that, we could do better. Part of that, there are a lot of uses of fossil fuels that we don't have very good alternatives for. We spend a lot of time arguing and talking about various technological pathways in the power sector, which is a little bit like looking for your keys under the light post, because that's where the light is. That's the easy place where there really are good options for decarbonization, so we like to argue about that. But once you get outside of the power sector into industry, heavy transportation, and agriculture, it gets much harder. Secondly, in the developed world, there are very significant trade-offs. The things that make us resilient to climate extremes, whether they are caused by climate change or just normal climate variability, are infrastructure. And infrastructure, building infrastructure, is a really energy-intensive business. Steel, cement, things like that. And again, those are exactly the sectors we don't have particularly good alternatives, low-carbon alternatives in. So for that reason, I think there's important trade-offs, especially when we think about poor countries and their use of fossil fuels, that we need to keep in mind in terms of what will make those countries in the coming decades most resilient to a changing climate.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Nordhaus. And Dr. Duffy, appreciated your mention of technology. Obviously, I agree with that. You mentioned your background and your experience, let's call it, with nuclear energy. At least that's where you started at Lawrence Livermore. And I'm wondering if you feel that if we do develop nuclear fusion, as many expect to in the next 10 years, I mean, there's almost nothing else we could do that would have more of a dramatic impact on reducing carbon emissions, I think, than nuclear fusion. Do you agree with that, or what impact do you think that would have if we came up with a cost-effective way of producing that kind of energy?
Well, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I just want to clarify. My experience at Lawrence Livermore National Lab was with nuclear weapons.
I knew that. I was
not actually.
but still nuclear. I was hoping you could.
I'm proud to be a tree hugger, but I don't think there's too many tree huggers who've detonated nuclear bombs.
Okay.
As far as nuclear fusion goes, I mean, it's been 30 years in the future for at least 30 years.
Okay.
I will say I do support Mr. Nordhaus's opinion that we need to make better use and more extensive use of nuclear fusion.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Duffy. I'm going to do something that I don't do very often, and that is, without objection, yield myself an additional minute. And the reason I'd like to do so is because Dr. Curry is not here, but I would like to put up a slide that I was going to use had she been here. And I'd like all members to take a look at this. And you will see that for the last 100 years, sea level rise has been basically constant. It's been going up at about 1.8 millimeters per year, and you'll see that there appears to be no correlation between the increase in the sea level and carbon emissions. And I just want to put that up there for our edification. I was going to ask Dr. Curry about it, but I think it kind of speaks for itself.
I'd be happy to comment on that, Mr. Chair. You know, you've shown a sea level record from one location.
Right. This is San Francisco.
Which is San
I've looked at
Francisco.
Also Boston, which appears to be the same.
The rate of global sea level rise has accelerated and is now 4 times faster than it was 100 years ago.
Is this chart inaccurate then?
It's accurate, but it doesn't represent what's happening globally. It represents what's happening in San Francisco.
All the charts I've seen, whether it be San Francisco, whether it be Boston, or anywhere else, show about the same degree of increase. I'm welcome to look at whatever you want to propose, but this is...
be happy to show that to you.
These are objective charts that I've seen. Though, thank you, Dr. Duffy. That concludes my questions, and the ranking member, Ms. Johnson.